Alrighty, folks, looks like we are live. And
Hello, hello.
hello. Looks like we have we have Ben Jackson on the show today
Hey,
with us.
good to see everybody.
Great. So I'm George. I'm one of the founders of Solo. Doing this webinar today. We're going to be talking about bankruptcy. If there's any issues with the audio and visual, let me know. If you have any questions about bankruptcy or about debt lawsuits, go ahead and put those into the chat. We reserve a bit of time here at the end for any questions that you might have. And with that, Ben, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, George. It's great to see you again and great meeting everybody that's in the live chat. So, yeah, bankruptcy. It's a thing that a lot of people don't like to talk about, and I am one of the weird people that does. And the reason for that is that I am the co founder and chief product officer of an organization that helps people get out of debt, primarily through bankruptcy. And the reason that I do that is because bankruptcy honestly saved my life and put me on the path to the American dream in a way that I never really expected. So, very long story short, when I was in my 20s, I racked up a ton of debt when I had a small business that failed. And it got to the point where the interest on my debt was like more than my monthly expenses, right? So I was paying more in interest on these credit cards than I was just to stay alive. And my debt was growing way faster than my income. And so I had a moment after about 2 years of struggling, working on, 80 hours a week driving Lyft, Uber, like doing all these things that people tell you you're supposed to do to build wealth, it not working, me falling deeper and deeper into debt. And I was like, man, something has to give. This is just miserable. Like I felt like I was drowning. And then lo and behold, one day, just laid up at night, worrying about life, worrying about money, I stumbled across this idea of Chapter 7 bankruptcy. And I said, bankruptcy, that's a terrible thing. Like, that's when you give up and say, like, I screwed up and you don't take accountability for yourself, right? And so for a while, I kind of ignored it and didn't take action on it at all because it just felt wrong to me. And the more I thought about it and looked at and learned about what it actually was, I recognized, like, oh, this is actually something that our government has written into law so that when people fall into a situation that they can't get out of, they have a way out. And I looked at my life and I said, man, I'm doing everything right, right? Like, this isn't me being lazy. I'm working a lot. I'm saving as much as I can. I'm not spending frivolously, and it's not working. And maybe this bankruptcy thing could be a way to fix this problem. So I, held my breath, dove in, and about 6 months later, I got a piece of paper in my hands that said all of my debt was gone. And I can't even tell you how good that felt. Like, it was literally like this chain that had been tied to my ankle was pulled off, and I could run, walk, run, even fly forward, and actually like building the life that I wanted. And so I decided that because this was such an amazing thing that I really had misunderstood, that I wanted to go to law school to learn how to help other people find that same freedom through bankruptcy. And then I started the nonprofit Upsolve, where I work today, to make it way easier, like TurboTax style easier for people to file bankruptcy. And now we're expanding that mission to other forms of debt relief and credit boosting as well. So I could talk about this all day. I'm open to any questions. George, you want to ask about it? Any questions anybody in the audience has, fire away.
Fantastic. I like what you said about bankruptcy being written into law. I mean, it's so important. It's in the Constitution, even, isn't that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is wild, right? Like, there's very few things that are represented like that deeply in American law.
Right. Not even the right to vote for the president isn't there, but the right to file for bankruptcy.
No comment on voting and presidencies.
Right. Right.
Well, we want to get more views. We could go contrarian. So,
yeah. No, that's great. So bankruptcy turned out very well for you. Where do you think you would be if you weren't able to file bankruptcy?
Honestly, probably nowhere. I say that it saved my life because life is really only worth living when you're able to have time and energy and attention for your family and friends, and when you have your health. And the way that I was working, I didn't have time for anything, and I was making myself miserable. So, like, I don't want to over exaggerate, like, but I do really think that it saved my life and gave me a chance to just kind of breathe and take a look and say, what do I want to do next? And I definitely wouldn't have gone to law school had I not been able to file bankruptcy, because there's no world in which I would have been able to afford it and go to law school and work as much as I was working. I definitely wouldn't have ended up in the position that I'm in now, where I work at a job where I get to help other people find freedom, and where my own life has come around to the point that I now have, the house that I dreamed of, right? Like out in the woods in New Hampshire. And I now have a child that I feel like I can provide for. And it was all because I was able to get that little bit of breathing room and allow my money and the earnings that I had to start working for me and to earn interest for me, instead of earning interest for the credit card companies that just had this stranglehold on me.
Fantastic. I love that. In your case, how much did it cost you to file for bankruptcy?
It only cost me the filing fees. I don't remember what they were back then. I want to say it was $395 at the time. I did it on my own, but I almost didn't. And this is an interesting story. So anybody that knows anything about bankruptcy has probably heard some bankruptcy lawyer online, right? Like if you lived in like the Illinois area, I don't know if this is national, but like the Peter Francis Geraci like info tapes thing about bankruptcy. There's a lot of lawyers that market bankruptcy services who are usually pitching something called Chapter 13. There's a really high level, there's two different types of bankruptcy that people like you and me would typically engage with. Consumer bankruptcy is the bucket that those things fall into. There's Chapter 7 and there's Chapter 13. So Chapter 7 is what I ultimately did, and that is any debt that you have that is unsecured, meaning it doesn't have an asset that the bank could take if you don't pay your debt. Any debt that's unsecured, generally speaking, with a couple of exceptions, can just completely go away in a bankruptcy proceeding. And that's kind of called a liquidation bankruptcy. Chapter 13 is what most people end up talking about when they talk to a lawyer. And the way Chapter 13 works is you pay a lawyer to put together a plan, essentially negotiation with your creditors, that the judge in this case then approves for you to pay back your debt over time. And what tends to happen with this, and you can look at the data and this bears out, what tends to happen is people never actually end up paying off their debt. And so the plan fails, and so they end up right back where they started. Chapter 13 is different, and it's not what most lawyers who are talking about 13 end up doing. So back to the story I promised I would tell you. When I first started looking at bankruptcy, I was very interested in Chapter 7, not interested in Chapter 13, because I was already trying to pay stuff off, wasn't working. So I met with a lawyer, everything seemed great, sat in his office, and he said, okay, great. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you on a payment plan. And I was like, what? And it's going to cost $6,000. And I was like, what? Like, is that what this is? I actually almost signed up with him, and I'm really glad that I didn't, because there's no way I would have been able to keep up with that payment plan. And if I'd had $6,000, I wouldn't have been trying to file bankruptcy in the first place. And I've found now, talking to the 17,000 people that Upsolve's been able to help file bankruptcy, that is a really common story for many people. Need to pay a lawyer, can't afford it, getting the runaround on what the bankruptcy type that's actually good for them is, and ultimately nothing happens until they find Chapter 7 and we help them file.
Fantastic. So you're saying, so you were able to file for bankruptcy in your case for $359?
I believe it was $395 at the time. Don't quote me on that because it was a while back. Right now it's $495 is the typical filing fee. Right. And for many people who are eligible based on income, you can actually get a waiver of that fee. If you file with a lawyer, it's going to cost you usually between $2,000 and $6,000. Right. If you file with Upsolve's tool, it's completely free to you, and it walks you through the process from start to finish.
Fantastic. And so you talked with a lawyer about a Chapter 13 bankruptcy. That would have costed $6,000, plus you would have just been on a payment plan to pay off everything. Right. You probably would have defaulted on that plan, and then everything would have become due again, so you would have just thrown $6,000 away, essentially.
Exactly, right? Which I did not have to throw away.
Right. But then, thankfully, you did a little bit more research. You found out you qualified for Chapter 7, and you filed it yourself.
I did, right. Which I don't recommend. You can definitely do it, but I am very persistent, and it took me, I want to say, 3-ish months of getting the wrong forms together, going to the clerk's office, realizing I'd done it wrong, missing a form. There's somewhere on the order of like 140 pages in most Chapter 7 applications. So I remember at one point I literally had like stacks of paper on my bed in my room of like, this is my stack of evidence for this is my stack of evidence for this. Which form is this? I don't know. And I went into the clerk's office with that stack, and she's like, "What are you doing?" So I wouldn't recommend doing it on your own.
Right.
Our tool makes it super easy, puts the whole thing together in a packet. You print it out, you go in, you hand it to them. There's instructions. You don't have to deal with the chaos that I dealt with.
Right. 140 pages is quite a bit. That's like a novel.
Yeah.
That's like a small novel.
Yeah, a couple trees die for your financial freedom.
Right. Right. There we go. Okay. Okay. In your experience going through this, how long did the bankruptcy impact your credit?
That's a great question. So this varies from person to person because it kind of depends on where you started. I thankfully had pretty good credit going into this because I'd been able to keep up with my debt, but I was starting to fall behind, which is what put me in the position of saying, like, I got to do something about this. Like, not only is this eating into my ability to build like any future for myself, but it's getting to the point where my credit's getting hit. So I went in with a pretty decent credit score to start. I want to say that when I filed, I was around like 720. And after I filed, it dropped down about 80 points. So I was down to about, I can't do math, six, somebody check me on this, 640, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
After that filing. And today I'm right back up where I started. And I was there about a year or so after filing bankruptcy. And the primary reason for that is there are some pretty quick and dirty credit things. Well, dirty is the wrong word. There's some pretty quick and easy credit things you can do to boost your credit score pretty quickly after bankruptcy.
Nice.
But I took a big hit, but it went away relatively quickly. And it definitely wasn't as big of a hit as I would have taken had I stayed in debt and kept trying to deal with it myself.
Yeah, if your score is at a 640, you probably were pretty proactive about filing bankruptcy, I'd imagine, right? It can get worse than 640, that's for sure.
Yep, definitely. And what I see for most people who come to Upsolve is their credit score is already in the tank. Like they're down in the low to mid 500s. Some of them are low 600s, and those scores, they tend to have had much of the damage that's going to be done already done. And the cool thing with that is if you're in that position and you file, you're not going to experience much negative on your credit. And you are going to experience a pretty quick positive boost once all that bad debt goes away. So we often have people who file and their credit score goes up.
Right. The credit score can actually go up. Okay, so you did Chapter 7 instead of Chapter 13. Was this after 2008? My understanding is that there were some like regulatory changes around 2008 or so that changed the landscape of bankruptcy. Is that right?
So it was after 2008. So my knowledge of bankruptcy starts around when I started this, right, around 2015. So I wouldn't be able to speak to the difference there. What I can say is it was, if you don't have a lot of assets and you really are struggling with your debt, generally speaking, there's not a lot of risk in filing Chapter 7 bankruptcy. And we can help you figure out if you do have assets, which typically when there's complexity in bankruptcy, it's to do with your assets. Because the way Chapter 7 bankruptcy works is there's a trustee who's assigned to your case. They look at all of your assets, the things you own. They look at all of your debts, and they try to figure out what they can sell to cover those debts so that they can pay your creditors back. There are these things called exemptions, which under state and federal law protect certain parts of your assets. They say like, okay, you can take this, but you can't take, say, Ben's clothes, for example. Like you need clothes to live. And what many people find is that the exemptions more than cover their assets, meaning they don't lose anything in a bankruptcy unless they own a house or like a really expensive car. And so my experience of the post-2008 reforms is that most people who file bankruptcy and don't have assets have a pretty clean road to getting their debt discharged.
Great. We have a listener who said, it's from Tater, I should file for bankruptcy, but I'm going to fight my best to pay it back.
Yeah,
What do you
thanks
think
for
about that
sharing
thinking?
that, Tater. I shared that attitude for a long time. I spent probably about 3 years struggling with about $60,000 in credit card debt, just like making those payments. The thing that I would really encourage you to do, and this is something that really opened my eyes, is figure out the dollar amount that you're paying in interest and principal. Principal means if you owe $60,000, that's the principal. The interest is how much you're going to pay over time as you pay that back. Figure out what that dollar amount is, and then Google compound interest calculator. And what this will do is it'll help you figure out if you had that money in your pocket, instead of the credit card company having all that interest and original principal payment, how much would it be worth in the future? And what's insane is if you take, say, $10 starting in your 20s and you put that $10 into, say, a standard, index fund in the market, and that compounds year over year, you end up in your like 50s and 60s with something on the order of like, I think last time I did the math, it's like $140,000, even if you stop putting money in at age 30. So you start at 20, stop at 30. And if you look at that, if you look at the power that your money has saved, invested, when you're not paying 30% interest to credit card companies, it really becomes wild. Because then it's not a trade-off of, do I pay this $60,000 or not? It's a trade-off of, do I give up on the chance to have, $600,000-700,000 because I don't have this money to save, to invest, to use for other things between now and later? Because time is everything when it comes to money. And you can spend a lot more than you think you're spending trying to pay your debt back.
Time is everything when it comes to money. That's for sure. Yep. Compound interest matters a whole lot. You want to be,
It does.
You want to
It
be
does.
earning from interest rather than paying interest.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And I will say also, because I think this is important, I definitely still resonate with that idea that if you have debts, if you owe people money, you should do your best to pay them off. Whether it's true or not, it's core to who I am. I believe that. And if you're somebody who feels like that, there are things you can do to get out of debt, right? Chapter 13 can be an option for people who are more interested in paying off their debt if they think they're going to be successful at paying that off, which some people are. There's also things like debt management plans where you have someone who helps you budget, helps you pay off your debt at a lower interest rate. So there are a lot of ways to get out. Bankruptcy is often the fastest and the most effective one. But if you are interested in understanding those other options, Upsolve has a tool on our website at upsolve.org that helps you understand what your situation would look like with each of these tools and which one might be a good fit for you. Often it's bankruptcy, and if it's not, we'll tell you that.
Right. Nice. Yeah, it's certainly a nuanced consideration for everybody.
Definitely.
I spoke with an elderly gentleman once upon a time who I was talking with him about solo, and he told me that when he was younger, like in his 30s, he had an unexpected medical debt that turned out to be quite large. I don't remember the exact amount, but turned out to be quite large. And it was unexpected. He didn't even fully feel like he owed the debt, but he got onto a payment plan for $50 a month on the debt, and he paid $50 a month for like 30 or 40 years, and paid it off when he was like 70 or 80. And he told me about it. He felt great about it. He didn't feel bitter about that situation. He didn't feel like he was shafted. He felt like he was paying off the debt that he owed. Paid $50 a month.
And that can work great. Yeah, I think the thing is it's really hard to be honest with yourself when you're struggling with debt, like about especially if you are a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of person, which is why, Tater, I would encourage you, like, sit down for a second, do that math, and say, is this possible for me? And also, how does this feel? Like, how does this feel to have this debt tied around me if it's for 20, 30 years? And is that worth the trade-off of trying to pay it off?
Indeed. What about being disabled? We have Tater's actually following up with a question here. What about being disabled? How does that factor into this?
Yeah, so I'm guessing, and feel free, I'll answer what I think you're asking, and then if it's not that, please say it in the chat. So there are certain situations where the debt that you have can never be collected against you, meaning you're judgment proof in a way. And what that means is if you don't pay your debt and someone sues you, you don't have anything that they can legally take. And so you're kind of safe, or again, judgment proof in that instance. That often is the case if you're disabled, but not all disabilities apply the same way to a judgment proof assessment. We do have articles on our website. So if you just Google upsolve.org, judgment proof disability, you'll find something that'll kind of walk you through figuring out when a disability protects you from being sued. But it does not ever prevent you from filing bankruptcy.
Right. Great. Yes. And for us, right, so with, right, I would say being disabled definitely is a factor, right? I think the biggest question on when you're disabled is, are you going to be disabled for the remainder of your life, or is it a short-term disability that you're going to recover? It's a big factor. We got a question.
Definitely.
Got a question from Kevin. I was served on the 18th. I was served a debt lawsuit on the 18th of this month for an unpaid debt. Summons states I have 21 days to respond, or the court may decide against me without me being heard. Kevin, happy to take the first stab of that. So with Solo, you can use us to respond to the debt lawsuit. You can use our answer to respond. Definitely recommend doing that. And you can also use our software to settle. You can use Solo Settle to settle, make an offer to settle the debt. There's a variety of debt resolution options to you. Right? You could file for bankruptcy if you think that's like the best thing for you. You can also try to get a settlement. On a settlement, let's say you're being sued for like $1,000. You might be able to get a settlement for $700. Could be much less. Could be like $400. But the collector will reduce the amount of the debt, and you'll then probably get onto a payment plan or pay that all off at once, depending on your circumstances. So creditors and collectors oftentimes recognize the hardship that consumers face in these situations, and they want to work with you to allow you to repay that. So that's the situation there. Ben, what would you add?
Yeah, so you really have two problems when you're getting sued. You have, what do I do about this lawsuit? And then you have, what do I do about the debt that caused this lawsuit, right? And they don't necessarily have the same answer. So I totally agree with what George said. If you have a summons, responding to it is a great way to help protect yourself. So I'm sure many people know, if you don't respond to it and time goes on too long, oftentimes the debt collector can win simply because you didn't respond. So a tool like SoloSuit can be a great option to help you protect yourself from something like that happened. But that doesn't take care of your debt in many instances, right? You can settle on it. That's a thing to take care of your debt. But maybe you can't afford to settle. Maybe you owe $60,000. The creditor says, hey, I want $20,000. And you're like, well, I have $300 in my bank account. What the hell am I going to do here? So that is the instance where something like bankruptcy can be a great way to get rid of the debt. So you could use Solo to respond to the debt lawsuit, take care of that thing. And then you could use bankruptcy to take care of the underlying debt so that you can then start moving forward, not have to worry about the debt or the lawsuits. One cool thing to know about bankruptcy is that as soon as you file, there is what's called oh my gosh, I'm having a total brain fart. There's a stay that goes in place on collections, meaning that debt collectors can no longer call you. And typically any debt lawsuit that's in action just halts. There's no further progress on that until the bankruptcy is finished. That depends on the stage that your debt lawsuit is in, which is something that SoloSuit can help you figure out as well.
Right. Great. Yeah, it's a great point you make there, Ben, that the debt and the lawsuit are separate things. Yes. So the lawsuit is about the debt, but the lawsuit is not the debt. And so if somebody gets sued and then let's say the case even gets dismissed, the collector can still collect the debt from you after the lawsuit. It doesn't mean that you don't owe the debt just because you win the lawsuit. You can still owe the debt if you actually owe the debt.
Yeah, and even if you win the lawsuit, maybe it's not your only debt, right? Maybe it's just about this one credit card that was sold to this one collections agency, and you get over the lawsuit and you're like, oh great, now I still have $40,000 of debt every year at these other companies. So
Right.
you definitely want to address both of them if you can.
Right. Let's see. We got a question from Groovepreneur.
Love it.
He
Groovepreneur.
suggested to Kevin that Kevin, you should file an answer with SoloSuit. Thanks, Groove. And then
I love
Groove
it.
said, before bankruptcy, should you recommend or do you recommend 401k? A little bit cryptic there. I think he means like maybe using the 401k to pay off a debt. I guess how would you balance that? But, file bankruptcy.
Great question. Great question. So I'm not a financial advisor, so I'll couch anything like that's not financial advice. What I can tell you is that if you have a 401k, it's considered an asset, right? It's money that you have that could, in theory, be used to pay back your debt. Generally speaking, though, retirement accounts like 401ks are protected by bankruptcy exemptions. That there are some exceptions to that, so I definitely encourage you, do your research, talk to a lawyer, use a tool like Upsolve that can walk you through that. But it's usually safe in the bankruptcy. Like you're usually not going to lose it in the bankruptcy.
Even in a Chapter 7?
Even in a Chapter 7. There's usually exemptions that protect retirement accounts. Again, it depends on the type of retirement account. It's not always all of it, but usually you don't lose even the majority of it in a Chapter 7 filing.
Right. So there's that. Also with the 401k, if you withdraw from that to pay off a debt, usually if you withdraw from a 401k early, there's a penalty. The penalty is not like the end of the world. It might be pretty significant, but you should consider that penalty. I don't think there's a waiver for the penalty for the purposes of paying off the debt.
I don't believe so. And one other thing to look out for is if you withdraw, and I actually did this, so it's interesting that you're asking this. I withdrew from my 401k to pay back some of my debts before I ended up filing bankruptcy. And this didn't happen for me, but it has happened for many people that I've worked with. If you pay back a debt and it looks like there's any sort of preference, meaning like you paid it to one company and not another, it can make your bankruptcy harder. So even though you're trying to do the right thing, you can end up in a position where they're like, well, wait a minute, why are you doing this instead of this? And so often it's better before you do that, if you don't think it's going to solve your problem, to take a look at your options through bankruptcy and see what might happen to your debt and your 401k if you were to do that instead, so that you don't run into any problems if you ultimately do end up having to file anyway.
Nice. Fantastic. We're about at time. We're half past the hour. Let's just do a little lightning round here and last questions.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
So when is it too late to attempt to settle? I can take
question.
The first step of that. It's not too late. So long as the lawsuit's open, you can settle at any time. You can even settle after the lawsuit's over. Even if you're being garnished, you can still try to settle.
Yep. Great question.
Another question, can you still file bankruptcy if the payments are current?
The payments are current. So you can file bankruptcy at any point in time. My payments were actually current when I filed bankruptcy. I filed because I knew that if I kept paying this much interest, I was basically just going to be poor forever, which I couldn't deal with because I was paying so much that my debt was just getting bigger no matter how much I paid off. So don't have to have fallen behind. Totally fine to do that.
Question from Kevin. Are there any avenues for a veteran?
Any avenues for a veteran? So I'm assuming you're asking something around the lines of, can you get more debt relief as a result of being a veteran? So there's nothing that I know of in the bankruptcy code or the collections code that would prevent anything worse from happening or get you any better interest rates. I know that you do have access to often better interest rates for financing than the general public. And so if you're somebody who wants to do something called consolidation, the way that works is, let's say you have a bunch of credit card debt that you're paying 30% on. If you get a consolidation loan at a lower interest rate, you might be able to get a loan for your $60,000 in credit card debt at 7% interest. That's going to be way less expensive than paying off $60,000 at 30% interest. And that's the only thing that I'm aware of. George, I don't know if you're aware of any other advantages you might have as a veteran other than like the lower interest rates through veteran services.
I'm not aware of any advantages. However, there do seem to be many provisions for veterans. So certainly something to look into further. All right, then last question here from John. What if the suing party is not willing to settle? Well, if the suing party is not willing to settle and you feel like you owe the debt, you can certainly consider bankruptcy. You can consider doing that. You can consider pursuing the lawsuit. You can also kind of expand the concept of settlement, right? So if they aren't willing to settle, are they just asking for the balance in full on the lawsuit? Oftentimes, a collector might think about that as a settlement, because if you don't settle and you don't declare bankruptcy and you lose the lawsuit, you'll probably end up owing about 1.7x the amount of the debt. So add 70% of the debt value on top of that lawsuit. That's a pretty conservative estimate about what you'll owe. So if they aren't asking for that, they might consider asking the balance in full to be a settlement. But oftentimes it is a negotiation, so you can just continue to try to negotiate as well.
And the only thing I'll add to that is whatever is agreed to in a settlement, so let's say you do have a collector that just will not settle with you at all, doesn't have any bearing on your ability to file bankruptcy. So you could have just the most cantankerous debt collector of all time who will not be allowed to do that or reject your bankruptcy filing, which is the benefit of a trustee, right? Part of this process is this trustee that looks at your assets and debts and negotiates with the creditors. And there's only so far that creditors can go if you're making a good faith effort to deal with the debt. So it shouldn't block you from bankruptcy, even if they won't settle.
Right. All right, folks. We are going to call that a wrap. Thanks so much for showing up.
Yeah, good to see everybody. Thanks for the questions.
Fantastic. Ben, where can people find out more about what you do?
Well, it's expanding. So you can check out upsolve.org. That's where we have all of our content, our articles on how to get out of debt, as well as our tools that will help you figure out which debt option is right for you and then do those options. We're also now on all the social media channels. So you can look up Upsolve Bankruptcy. We're on TikTok, we're on YouTube, we're on all of the places that I feel too old to be on at this point. So definitely look forward to seeing you wherever makes sense for you to find us.
Perfect. That sounds great. Thanks so much for coming on the show.